the future, hopefully. So everybody, my name is Luis Betancourt. I'm the director here at the Mansueto Institute. And Jennifer's talk today, but also a series of talks this spring, will be dedicated to something we've been calling Urban Cognition, which is an initiative here at the Institute. And it's led by Mark Berman, professor in psychology. And he'll say a few words about it too. But the idea is that from the beginning even of Chicago School of Sociology, one of the central problems of understanding cities was to use them as complex environments that people need to adapt to and make the most of as they can as they go. And this is a very different perspective from just starting with some rational choice model, which tends to be very artificial and doesn't explain many things that we actually see in reality. So we've been sort of looking at the literature a lot, and I have to say, without saying too much, that I've been really excited about Jennifer's papers. I think she really is summarizing, proposing, creating, in some sense, conceptual theory that allows us to understand many things. I think today's talk will be about issues of low socioeconomic status and poverty in complex environments, how people make decisions, how these decisions are adaptive, but have certain characteristics, how there are issues of psychological distance and levels of construal and other things that orient how we understand the psychology in these situations. But then she's also done really interesting work. I just was reading your paper on populism and some political movements, which are also very interesting. So it's really a great pleasure to have it start this series in the spring. And I think without further ado, I'll take it away. But a big fan of your work, Jennifer. So Mark, please, would you say a few more words, and then we'll start the talk.
Sure, I'll just quickly say, so Jennifer, we're so happy for you to join us here. So Jennifer Sheehy-Skeffington is a professor of social psychology at the London School of Economics. She got her PhD from Harvard with a really all-star group of advisors, Jim Sedanius, Mahzarin Banaji, with very instrumental implicit bias work, Steve Pinker, and Jennifer Hochschild. And as Louise said, Jennifer is doing some really, really interesting work looking at social dominance theory, but then also things related to socioeconomic status and sort of the social environmental factors that affect people's decision-making. So some decisions might look irrational at first blush, but when you dig into people's socioeconomic statuses and their types of environments, these seemingly irrational behaviors can actually look quite rational. And Louise and I have been very inspired by a lot of your work, Jennifer. So thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. Let's give a nice welcome to her.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. It's a real privilege to be able to speak to this group, and it was great to have the excuse to read around some of what you're doing and also to be able to see some of the speakers I'm preceding this term. As you both said, I'm a social psychologist and a political psychologist, so I have a whole other stream of research that's focused on particularly the psychological foundations of political attitudes and behaviors, but also the political consequences of some of the psychology. So one aspect that might be relevant in that stream of work is we published 2 papers not so long ago looking at perceptions of inequality. And I'm still continuing to look at that perceptions of inequality in one's environment, especially as one commutes to work and in the spaces one lives, and how that shapes perceptions of society and also well-being, and in particular how your ideology shapes those. So whether or not you notice cues about poverty or inequality in one's environment are also in turn shaped by ideology. But that's not what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about work that started with my PhD and then built from that. And that is putting forward this notion of a socio-ecological perspective on decision-making in low-income contexts. Now, bear with me, because the way I approach this talk is generally from, thinking about psychologists, addressing psychologists and trying to get them to think about settings more, trying to get them to think about ecologies and environments more. I don't need to do that with this group because they're already thinking about ecologies and environments. So I'm sure you're far ahead of me in this rhetorical move, but hopefully it'll be helpful still to think about some of the psychological mechanisms that might be important as you think about urban cognition, and also some of the recent research and looking at the impact on these perspectives. Great. So yeah, what do psychologists normally do? Well, what psychologists normally do is we think about, we do research on, and then we think about how to cultivate, we advise on how to cultivate mindsets that can help people deal with adversity. So for example, if you're someone thinking about scaling this pretty intimidating peak, it will be helpful to harness your psychological resources to help you to be able to tackle that the best way. And I just want to give you an overview of 5 key, what one could call mindsets or kind of umbrella terms for psychological mechanisms that tend to be the most important in this field. One is to believe in yourself. You're not going to be able to achieve your goals if you can't believe that you can do what you want to do and that what you do is going to affect the world. In psychology, we refer to this broadly as perceived control. I'll go into detail of these in a bit. Another thing you need to do is not get distracted, right? You need to stay focused on what you're doing and harness all your intellectual resources there. You need to keep your eyes on the prize, not on other things. Don't get distracted by temptations. Focus on the goal at the very end. You need to look on the bright side. Maybe you have setbacks. You need to see them as learning opportunities. You need to maintain positive affect. And then you need to see others as people who can potentially help you reach your goal. And broadly to be able to trust and lean on others. Now, what I want us to think about today is whether how these things might play out when the kind of mountain that you're facing is more like a mountain of food in a food bank, is more like a situation where you're so scarce in resources that you don't have enough money to make sure that you and your family have enough to eat, and that your salary or income is so unpredictable that just to be sure you can eat, you need to go to a food bank. And then also the social experience of attending places in order to obtain free food from groups of people, and that sense of what role do you have in society as you're accessing these kinds of aid, which are increasingly accessed and increasingly needed, especially in the UK and the US these days with the cost of living crisis. And in that context, in that very low income context, these kinds of mindsets are very widely talked about. These kinds of mindsets are described in ways as psychological tools to help people to come out of these situations of adversity. So this is what psychology can do. Psychology can offer behavioral interventions to help people to develop the right mindset to get out of poverty, to get further away from poverty, and to be able to rise up in society. And that's because there's seen to be a behavioral problem among those at the bottom of society. Those who are lower in socioeconomic status are less likely to engage in helpful financial behaviors. They're more likely to take out high interest loans that engage them in cycles of debt. They're less likely to perform well and invest in education, less likely to exercise, more likely to eat unhealthy food, and engage in unhealthy levels of drinking, alcohol, and smoking. Now, before one calls a psychologist, one needs to make a very important point, of course, and especially a point about environments, in terms of acknowledging the extent to which there are barriers in particular contexts to even being able to make the right kind of decision. And I'm sure you think about this a lot. The most obvious are, for example, barriers to being able to get exercise. It may not be that you have a lovely park with an exercise machine. It may be that you barely even have a walkable environment. And also the fact that low income contexts are more likely to, or less likely to have available inexpensive, healthy food, and are more likely to feature predatory advertising from fast food chains, from purveyors of alcohol and cigarettes. But even if we let's just put all of that aside for a minute, because if you can take care of behavioral constraints from the environment, or if we look, for example, at a behavior that is costly, so that shouldn't be, that for which finances aren't seen to be a barrier because it's actually costly to engage in it, such as smoking, surely there has to be a role for the individual here. Surely there has to be a sense of fault that can open up into a sense of coaching and interventions to improve people's decision-making, so that they know about the health problems associated with smoking, and so that they don't decide to take that next cigarette, which simply doesn't make sense and makes their situation worse, both in a health sense and in a financial sense. The way I approach this, and this is not just me, it's quite a broad emerging field of research. I think you'll find it coming in similar perspectives coming from different areas. There is a whole psychology of social class, for example, that mostly looks at social class identity. But I think some of the most exciting work is looking around behavioral economics of poverty, my own variations on that and interventions to that, which I'll talk about. And then also in particular, bridging that, bridging those perspectives with perspectives from human behavioral ecology. Because it's behavioral ecology as a field that is thinking about behavior as always responsive to environmental cues, environmental constraints. Now, I know you'll hear from Willem Frankenhuis and Daniel Nettle later in the term, and they're kind of much closer to behavioral ecology than I am. So what I'll talk to you about here is socio-ecology, or socio-ecological approach, which is just a broad umbrella term for a way of thinking about psychology, thinking about decisions and behaviors as responsive to contexts that are not only cultural, because we often talk about culture, but that are also material, and that are not just social, but are also societal, that things going on in wider society. And what I want to argue is that a whole lot of decision-making patterns that are associated with the socioeconomic gradient can be better understood and then perhaps more sustainably improved if we consider the extent to which they reflect a shift in our decision-making patterns in response to socio-ecological cues of the kind of context we're living in. Foremost among which are cues about what is the situation with material resources and what is the situation with social resources. How scarce versus abundant are each of these two things, and how unpredictable versus unpredictable are they? Because to the extent that resources are scarce or that we can't predict when we're going to get them, that should shape the kind of behaviors that we engage in. And we need to think about resources not just as us having money to put food on the table, but also being socially valued and therefore having reliable cooperation partners with whom we can behave in interdependent ways. So both material resources and social resources. Okay, so they're the broad socio-ecological cues. Then I'll talk you through those 5 psychological mechanisms, and we'll just consider some of the evidence base with a view to how these cues, especially around scarcity, or I'll broadly lump scarcity and predictability into adversity, but I think you'll see from the behavioral ecological work how important it is to ultimately decouple them. And so we'll think about adversity as material and social, and then we'll go through what we know about the impact of these forms of adversity on the various sets of psychological mechanisms that I outlined at the start. So to start with perceived control, this notion of believing in yourself, maybe you need that, for example, to be able to go out and take exercise because you know that exercising is going to make a difference. One aspect of perceived control that you may have heard of is what's known as self-efficacy. This is quite widely known. Self-efficacy, the extent to which you believe that you're in control of your actions, your perceived competence. Can I do this thing? But I want to highlight another aspect of control, which is just as, if not more important, which is response efficacy. So that's the extent to which you feel that your actions or your behaviors actually have an impact on important outcomes of your life. That's sometimes called outcome expectations or perceived efficaciousness. And because I think it's worth reflecting on what decisions I make shouldn't just be a product of whether I think I can make them. They should also be a product of whether the behaviors that fall out of them will actually have an impact on my life outcomes. And to the extent that response efficacy is very low, no level of self-efficacy will fix you. So in the exercise example here, it's only by actually thinking that exercising will make a difference to whether or not you have a healthy heart that it is worth engaging in your self-efficacy to exercise. So, right, so what do we know then? I'll be talking through some of the work in my lab. This is Ivan Cano, my 4th-year PhD student. One of the things he looks at is just a world value survey. It's a very handy survey source of insights around psychological aspects tied to socioeconomic aspects. And here's just a really basic observation. The lower you are in income, the less perceived control you have over your life outcomes, right? And you feel that what you do has no real effect on what happens to you. And we find this if we look at it in a multi-level sample, controlling for various level 2 characteristics and other individual level characteristics that should predict it. But it's one thing to demonstrate something like this. And of course, this doesn't get us anywhere or doesn't get us too far in terms of thinking about how ecologies are shaping decision-making, to the extent that it can't get us beyond the inferences of causality from correlation. So perhaps it's the case that those lower in control end up earning less income as a result of that. And it's with that in mind that I, especially in my PhD and postdoc work, engaged in a whole experimental program of work that tried to engage middle income participants and to expose them, even temporarily, to some of the experiences of material and social adversity, just to see whether even temporary exposure to those experiences might lead to a similar mindset shift or a set of decisions such as that described as all too prominent among those low in SES. Now, of course, I must caveat, these experimental manipulations do not actually capture much of the richness of the reality of life in poverty or low-income contexts, and there are a lot of wrinkles and complications that maybe we could return to at the end. But for now, I think it can be a useful proof of principle, especially to the extent that in sociology and social policy, for example, we found that there was a hesitation to even discuss behavioral components of marginalization because it seemed to be blaming people, blaming poor people for their situation. If you can take middle-income people to just get a little bit of a feel, and here's an example of how we give a feel, and maybe you can at least demonstrate that there is a causal impact from situation to behavior. So in terms of perceived control, what do we do in this study? This is PhD work with Jim Sedanius. I came up with this household budgeting game. It's not terribly sophisticated, but your job is to balance your household income over a number of months. You play the game over a number of months, and so your situation gets exacerbated in various ways. And you have a number of set outgoings. And of course, you have a set income to start with. What we're doing is we're randomly assigning people to then have a high income in the game versus have a low income in the game. And we're not actually tracking, or we are tracking, but the key dependent measure is not what they spend their money on. The key dependent measure is to see how has experiencing playing this game as a rich versus a poor person shaped their sense of control, because perceived control is seen to be a trait, right? If you look at some of the items here, this is from the Personal Mastery and Perceived Constraints scale, a very widely used one, and that's been shown to vary with SES. It's responses to items such as what happens to me in the future depends mostly on me, versus reverse coded item, I have little control over the things that happen to me. So these are seen to be kind of a stable, enduring trait. Also things like self-efficacy in specific domains such as health, you can see the items there for measuring that. And what we found is that if you are playing this game in the high SES condition, then you report a greater level of sense of control over your life outcomes, even after playing the game. This is not about the power control you had in the game. We find that that changes, of course, but also even after that, if I ask you about your life in general, you report being more in control of your life and being more likely and feeling more confident about behaving in an efficacious way with regard to managing your health. And of course, the flip side of that is that if you're randomly assigned to be in the low SES condition, you're reporting lower sense of control and lower levels of health efficacy. And that's at least a kind of a proof of concept demonstration that there's aspects of this contextual experience that can shape what is previously assumed to be an enduring trait. Now, the other intervention I made at that early stages was to say, of course, poverty is not just a situation of absolute resources, it's a situation of relative resources. And this is where the notion of social adversity comes in. How do we experimentally manipulate relative resources? I had various paradigms. The one I used the most in my PhD was a false feedback prime, where we gather people's socio-demographic characteristics and then give them false feedback. Forgive me, economists, there's deception here. And telling them that they are either, in this case, at 24.3 percentile in society in terms of how they're doing in American society, where they sit by SES compared to other Americans, versus high in SES, it's something like 76.1. So all of this is pre-tested, of course, to check for believability, and it varies depending on the exact pointers vary depending on the context in which you do it. The other way in which I'd done it was a slightly more subtle one, although of course the effects get much smaller as a result, which is just to vary what is primed as you fill out an income form. So here we're filling out the income form. Okay, yeah, great, I'll fill out my income. Oh, all right, I didn't realize that so many people doing this study were earning above $1 million. I mean, this is quite extreme, but it is, I think, captured to some extent that feeling that we get where that viewing the scale from which we select where we sit gives us a sense of where others are sitting. And so what is randomly assigned here is the extent to which is whether or not you have this low income version of the income scale, a middle income version of the income scale, a control version, or a high income version. And in the high income version, you get to be in the very top category and everybody else is much lower. And so what we find in these studies, and I'm just showing you these with various other controls as well, is that if you're given positive feedback about where you sit in society, you report greater sense of control. You feel more powerful and in control of your life outcomes, but you don't rate yourself more positively. Sorry, you don't rate yourself as higher in sense of control by being given any kind of feedback. If you're given positive personality feedback, it doesn't shape your sense of control in that way. And the other way to try to gain specificity on these effects was to vary the traits in which you evaluated yourself. I'm particularly interested in thinking about control in terms of status and where we sit in a status hierarchy. And I think the reason we feel less in control of our life outcomes when this form of social adversity is made salient is in part because we feel low in a hierarchy, and that triggers a kind of low power mindset. So that's what's being assessed with the dominance assuredness as subscale of the Wiggins circumplex model. And so what you see here is in this, the income scales priming task, those low in SES rate themselves as lower in dominance and assuredness, as opposed to those who receive the income scales that make them feel in the middle or at the top. But we don't see any changes in ratings on other traits. It's just dominance power related traits. So that's social adversity and perceived control. And then what I'll do now is I'll just go through the other mechanisms and consider social and material adversity in similar ways. Now, executive functions you might particularly be interested in to the extent that you really do mean cognition when you say urban cognition. Sometimes when people say urban cognition, they just kind of mean a lot of psychological stuff, which is also totally fine. But here's our most cognitive aspect. Which is, you know, the executive functions are those high level cognitive processes that decide the direction to which the rest of our cognition or our reasoning is directed. So we can't even engage in our system 2 reasoning if we don't have executive functions focused in the right place. One of them is inhibitory control, the ability to resist a facilitated response for the sake of a target response. So in the Stroop task, which you see here, if I tell you that you need to tell me the color of the word, it is easy for you on the first, red, easy on the second, blue, harder on the third because you want to say red, but you're meant to say blue. So it's that ability to inhibit that prepotent response of red. Planning is another one, the ability to lay out a set of steps needed to reach a target goal. So I've looked at this with the Tower of Hanoi task, because there you are penalized for every move you make, and you need to arrive at a target array by moving these discs around between rods in as few moves as possible. So you do well by thinking in advance about the moves and then only making them when you're ready. And you can see how I've just thrown up the cigarette and the debt there, just to see the extent to which executive functions are involved in these kinds of daily tasks that you need to deal with, especially which are particularly high stakes if you're low in SES, and thinking, planning ahead, for example. Working memory is the ability to hold multiple pieces of information at the forefront of your mind. And in particular, working memory updating is what's being assessed with the Stroop task that's presented there. Sorry, with the NBAC task that's being presented there. We did a 2-back version of this. So what happens is people are seeing letters flashing up on the screen. The letter goes away, a fixation across another letter. You're told to press the space bar as soon as you see the letter. That's the same as the letter that appeared 2 trials previously. So what I need to do is I keep G in my mind, cross, then H in my mind, cross, then J in my mind, cross, then G in my mind, oh, press spacebar. I need to keep updating in my memory to maintain the last 2 stimuli. And that is relevant for filling out application forms and doing lots of tasks that require you to maintain a lot of information in your mind, especially really complex ones that are needed for accessing government benefits. Shifting is another one. Shifting is actually this ability to switch. It's also called cognitive flexibility, to switch between tasks and different goals, and multitasking, especially if you're handling multiple jobs and childcare responsibilities, something I hope I don't need to describe to many of you. But here you can see this version of the task assessing it, which is that sometimes you might be categorizing images based on shape, and then you need to switch to categorize them based on color. So you're switching the rules that you need to follow in the game. Okay. So what do we know about this? Well, the work that inspired me to look at some of this was coming out at the time from Sendel Moynathan and Eldar Shafir. And this is, I guess, quite well known now, especially the 2 science papers coming out of this work, demonstrating that just the experience of poverty or the salience of financial need can impede cognitive function. So in one prominent article by Anandi Mani and others, they showed how the same sugarcane farmers before a harvest, when they had greater financial need, are performing worse in cognitive control and worse on a measure of intelligence than those same farmers after the harvest, when they don't have financial strain. And then that when that rich and poor people actually can perform similarly on cognitive control. If you look at the pale bars on cognitive control and Raven's matrices, which is a measure of intelligence, but that the moment you give people a hard financial task to think about, such as how to do a car repair that's going to cost $1,500, I think is the example, then suddenly the performance of those low income drops. Because for those high in income, it's okay to maintain thinking about how I'm going to fix a car for $1,500 and then to do the task that you asked me to do. But if I'm low in income, it's actually quite stressful to imagine trying to address a car issue like this. And that the thinking goes in this work is that you have this kind of mental bandwidth narrowing or this cognitive load such that people are then performing worse in the cognitive task. And so people seem like they're worse in cognitive control or less intelligent, whereas actually what's going on is the salience of financial adversity is causing them to perform worse than they would if it wasn't there. Another way in which we've looked at this, and I kind of take a different approach slightly to some of that work. One is to say that scarcity is very specific, and different kinds of scarcity matter in different kinds of ways. And another is to talk about not just necessarily cognitive functioning as being impeded or being a deficit, but thinking about the modulation of cognitive functioning, thinking about psychological resources shifting in their focus, upregulating, downregulating in response to the kind of cues they're getting in these studies. So with that in mind, some work I did as part of a British Academy postdoctoral fellowship, and here's my collaborators there at Brunel University, was to look at this notion of specificity and of psychological shift in cognitive resources in the case of food scarcity. So what we did was we asked a sample of over 200 students to fast. They've been fasting for 12 hours. By the time they came into the study, they're then randomly assigned to either have this tasty breakfast or not. And then we administer cognitive measures. Now, it's already quite an established finding that if you're fasting for this length of time, you perform worse on cognitive tasks than if you're sated. But the variation we introduced in order to kind of try to resurrect some of this cognitive functioning was whether the task involved stimuli that are salient in a situation of scarcity, the stimuli in which you are scarce, in this case, food. Right, so we had a short-term memory task where people have to remember 15 words. They're not color-coded, they're all randomly mixed up, but I've color-coded them here so that you can see how I've matched the food words with a similar set of emotion words and neutral words for length and frequency. I then analyze memory of the food words and the non-food words separately. We also used 64 trials of a visual search task, but again, within subjects variation of the stimuli involved in the task. So here I have the version here would be find the kebab. I hope you can find it pretty quickly, especially for those of you who haven't had your lunch yet. But there is another version of this which has the exact same distractor stimuli in the exact same position, but where the kebab is there's a boot, like a boot that you would wear. So we have food stimuli versus clothing stimuli that are in turn matched for visual complexity and familiarity. And then we have a number of different arrays, sometimes small arrays, 16 item ones, and sometimes larger arrays. And they do this 64 times. Okay, and what do we find? Well, first of all, when it comes to non-food items, we replicate the previous findings that if you're in a food scarcity condition, then you perform worse in short-term memory recall. However, if you look at the food items separately, you see that pattern is not there at all. In fact, it looks like it's flipping in the opposite direction, although that's not significant. The interaction is significant, which is that it depends. The impact of scarcity on short-term memory depends on the specific stimuli, and it seems that deficit brought about by food scarcity in this case is very specific to non-food stimuli, and it seems to have gone away when you focus on what is the resource that's under threat or what is the resource that's in need. A similar thing with visual search here. Here you have to know that everybody's faster at finding food items over clothing items. So what we measure is the facilitation effect of food versus clothing items. And we found no differences or no significant differences in the larger arrays, but in the smaller arrays, those who are hungry are faster at finding food versus clothing items than those who are. So again, a kind of a cognitive facilitation once you look at the most relevant stimuli. Okay, so that's material adversity and executive functioning. What about social adversity? Again, I use these similar.
Jennifer.
Yeah.
There's a question. So
Oh,
can
yeah,
we try
sure.
this to see if I know it
Go for it.
sounds a little difficult, but let's see if we can do it. No, it's okay. Let's try it. Let's just see if it works.
Can you hear me, Jennifer?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Okay, great. Can you go back one slide? Yeah, this one. So I'm wondering here, do you interpret this as sort of a positive adaptation? And is there sort of, usually I would think of being under like hunger, food scarcity would just kind of limit cognitive capacity, but not sort of have this trade-off. So in some sense, you could even argue that for the non-food items, it might be adaptive to save energy and not recall those items well and save it for the food items. So do you think this is some kind of adaptive kind of mechanism, or is this sort of a deficit mechanism? I mean, here it kind of looks like it's sort of an adaptive mechanism.
Absolutely. No, I think that's spot on. I certainly see it through an adaptive lens. I mean, I don't measure adaptiveness because that's hard to do in terms of looking at the impact on reproductive fitness, for example. But I am inspired by, for example, the opportunity cost model of task performance from Kurzban et al. Kurzban's an evolutionary psychologist, that tries to understand some performance deficits, not in terms of a disruption or a deficit in cognitive functioning, but in terms of the reallocation of cognitive resources to something that is more pressing, to something that is more important. I don't think it's particularly mysterious. It's just that exactly that, when I'm in food scarcity and you present me with some completely abstract, irrelevant cognitive task, why should I perform well in that task, whether consciously reflected on or not? Or why should my brain be automatically attuned to abstract cognitive tasks when I'm facing food scarcity? It should be attuned to tasks involving food stimuli. And so in introducing these variations, I'm precisely trying to resurrect and to bring these cognitive resources back online in order to demonstrate that I don't think it's a deficit. I think it's a reallocation or a psychological shift.
Thanks.
And there's a different way in which we did this with with social adversity. So we had a number of studies. I have 4 studies showing this effect, where when we give people negative relative SES information, they perform worse on cognitive tasks. These are the results with the 2-back task. We showed again with the Tower of Hanoi and showed again with the Stroop task. But the reason I'm showing, and also we show it with a credit card decision-making task that I designed specifically to draw on executive functioning. So your likelihood to pick the best of a set of complex credit card loan offers that were based on these truth in lending disclosures that people actually do look at when they have a set of credit card offers. Your odds of picking the correct one are lower if you're experimentally primed to feel relatively low in SES. So now we're thinking about relative, right? We're thinking about social adversity. But what I did in this variation is rather than affecting the stimuli and the task, instead I varied how you frame the task to people, right? So in one version of it, we frame the task as in its normal way, the 2-back task or measures of executive functioning are linked to prefrontal brain activity and present some text and citations for that. But in another version, we say that that executive functioning is an important indicator of later life gains in SES, in socioeconomic status. And then we present some true citations for that. And these are little like introductory paragraphs that are matched on a number of characteristics. The key point is that in the latter situation, if I've just been primed to think that I'm doing much worse than others in society, socioeconomically, it's not that I'm just being now presented with some random cognitive task. I'm very distracted by the status threat that I'm facing. I should perform worse on a cognitive task if I were being adaptive to reading cues from my socioecology. But if you now present that task as a potential pathway for, or is linked to processes that are a pathway to later life gains in SES, as we know executive functioning is, then suddenly this task becomes a lot more relevant. It's relevant to help me address the resource that's under threat. This time, the resource that's under threat is status. This is kind of social resources. So what we find here is that in the low relevance condition, and this time it's with the UK sample, we had lower performance, just about lower performance on the 2-back task, but that difference, that performance decrement goes away once a task is presented in a way that's relevant to later life gains in SES. So the version of the 2-back task introduced as relevant to socioeconomic status doesn't see any performance differences in the high versus low SES condition. And this is just a replication of that effect with a different cognitive task. And here you can actually see, and the second one is that you can see that the low SES condition are actually performing better than the high SES condition, and once the task is made relevant to them. So it's precisely along the lines of what you're suggesting. Okay, let's just make sure I can get through the other cognitive mechanisms. The two I've talked through, I've studied the most, starting to look at self-regulation now. Self-regulation is understood in a lot of different terms. It taps into a lot of different aspects, whether you can, delayed gratification, if you can resist one marshmallow for the sake of two, such as in Walter Mischel's studies, temporal discounting, do you hold off on a current reward for a future reward? And you can see how this is relates to important later life decisions. What I'm looking at now in my lab with Julia Buza, and especially in her analysis of the Understanding Society UK Household Longitudinal Study, is to see the extent to which present orientation, which would be framed as poor self-regulation and studied specifically here in the context of smoking, is a function of and is related to over time your financial situation. So here what you're seeing is a prediction of how many cigarettes you smoke per day. And we find the exact same pattern for whether or not you are a smoker as a function of your description of your subjective financial situation. And with these data, we can also look in detail as to what feeds into your subjective sense of your financial situation. It turns out it's not just income, it's also a range of things, such as whether or not you can heat your home. And those things are even more important than income, which is really interesting. But the other thing that we can also look at this over time. And so this replicates between waves 5 and 11 as well, including the lagged variables. But the other thing we can do, and that we can only do this at one wave, so this is just correlational, is we can look at the extent to which this present-oriented decision to smoke, it's a decision that's maybe good for the present, gives you some stress relief, helps you bond with others, but definitely is harmful, it's costly, and leads to negative health behaviors. The extent to which that is born out of the stress associated with poverty or subjective financial strain versus that lowered sense of control you get, that lowered sense of control, lowered sense that what you do in life actually matters for your life outcomes. And I realize I don't have a graph of the model, but I have a bigger kind of model that I'm building out here that I'd happily throw up later. For me, perceived control is a key mediator of a lot of these effects, because that is what is part of the core aspect of how we read our socioecology. I think it's the most important thing we read from our socioecology. Does my behavior matter for my life outcomes? It's talked about in terms of extrinsic mortality risk, for example, in Daniel Nettles' work. Does when I will die depend on my own behaviors? And I think it's interesting here that it appears that decisions about whether or not and how much to smoke are more a function of your sense that you can control your life outcomes, or that holding off on a current reward will actually have any input, will actually matter at all. More so than just plain old stress. It's not just that you're stressed out, it's kind of this kind of rational recalculation or recalibration of the perceived control, the effect you actually can have on your life outcomes. And to the extent that you can't have any impact, then why should you give up on a current reward for the sake of a future reward? Speaking of the marshmallow studies, I really like this variation from Kidd et al., where what they did was they took the same kids in the marshmallow study and they first introduced an experimental variation in terms of whether or not the experimental situation was shown to be reliable versus not. The experimenter, before they do the marshmallow task, either delivers on a promise to give them some coloring pencils or doesn't. And here what you find is that the socioeconomic differences in performance in the marshmallow task, which are well documented, low SES kids tend not to wait, are wiped out once you have ecological cues. If you are clear that the experimenter is unreliable, then it maybe means that that second marshmallow isn't really on the way and nobody waits for the second marshmallow, or barely anybody waits for the second marshmallow. But if you give a very clear cue from the environment that we are in a reliable ecology where promises will be kept and we can have an influence over what will happen in the future, then everybody's waiting for the second marshmallow. So the implication there is that these socioeconomic differences in perceived to be trait levels of delayed gratification are actually, in fact, a function of people's inferences of the kind of worlds they live in. And if you don't give any information about that in an experimental setting, then people will just draw on what they've read from their environment growing up. And if you grow up in an environment where people don't keep their promises, where things are unstable and changing in an unpredictable way, or where you have no impact on your life outcomes, then it doesn't make sense to hold off for the future. And you see this in the power literature as well, that if you're low in power, you engage in more temporal discounting. Okay, what about positive affect? This is something I don't study so much. There's already some great work from Johannes Haushofer looking at the negative affective dimension of poverty and how giving people money can improve their happiness. I have looked at the affective dimension of poverty with Ivan, especially in terms of shame and the shame experienced with poverty and low subjective SES. And we find, and this is, again, we also find this in a cross-lag model over time, and that the lower you are in SES, the less response efficacy you report, so the less in control of your life outcomes, but also the less social contribution you think you're giving. And that makes you feel more ashamed of your socioeconomic situation. And we know that shame has lots of negative knock-on consequences for well-being. So the last of the mechanisms is social trust. This is, again, something I'm only starting to look at, so we'll mostly be presenting data from others. But often how social trust is studied is just in terms of this single question, not invented by psychologists. This is generally political scientists writing the European Social Survey. Generally speaking, would you say that most people can be trusted, or they need to be very careful in dealing with people? Now, what I think is missing in an item like this is the question of who is this person? Who are these most people? And I think that more illustrative of what's going on here are measures that can differentiate between in-group or interpersonal trust and out-group or impersonal trust. And some versions of World Values Survey can do that. We can also look at the notion of radius of trust, which I'll talk about now in a moment. Using the World Values Survey, Jan Jakimowicz and collaborators have looked at how income does positively predict general social trust. So the higher you are in income, the more you trust in general, but not trust in one's community. So it seems community level trust doesn't have a relationship with income. Then Delhay et al., coming from sociology, introduced this notion of radius of trust, which is actually the regression coefficient when you look at the relationship between responses to that general social trust item and responses to items that are more specific about whether we're talking about trust in people we know versus trust in people we've never met or meet for the first time or of another nationality. And the question then becomes, and this is something that Ivan has looked at, which is that what is the relationship between socioeconomic status and how narrow your sense is of social trust? How narrow your radius of trust is versus how broad it is, because this is based on reasoning that if you're growing up in a very adverse environment, perhaps you don't necessarily don't trust anyone, because you need to be more interdependent. You're more selective in your social trust. You have a lot of trust and prosociality with those immediately around you, but not much trust in society at large or in institutions. And that might help us reconcile some seemingly contradictory findings around what the relationship is between socioeconomic status and prosociality and trust. If you compute in-group trust bias, this is another way of demonstrating this kind of this constriction in social trust. We again find that it is more constricted among those low in SES. And why might that be? Well, another reason that might be is it could be that you've had bad experiences of interacting with people, and pushing back on this idea that necessarily, even though trust in society at large might be problematic, you might not trust in your community. You might still have trust in your community. It depends what kind of community you live in. As Julie's shown in analyzing understanding society, the lower you are in income, the more likely you are to live in communities that you perceive to have lower levels of social cohesion. And so perhaps, community trust or enhancing community trust, it is only helpful to the extent that A, you're not living in a social milieu which has had total social breakdown, perhaps because people are living close to what Daniel Nadel calls the desperation threshold. So you then infer that other people are really up against the wall, and so therefore maybe they'll do anything and I can't trust them. But also maybe people don't have the material means to help you out. And so material adversity is intersecting with social adversity in this way. We also know that social trust, for example, goes down if you've had experimental exposure to social exclusion or ostracism using the cyberball game. And what we're doing now, what Julia and I are doing, is looking at the impact of social support on perceived control and present orientation through experimental games. And what we want to vary is the extent to which you perceive your potential cooperation partners, the people who could potentially help you, as being exposed to social material or social adversity. And so I think what's going on when it comes to the social setting is not just do you have the right mindset in approaching to others, but to what extent are you inferring from the broader ecology that you both share about whether or not people are likely to behave in a cooperative way. Okay. So now just bringing around to a summary, and I'm not sure I'll have much time to talk about interventions, but I hope I've convinced you that mindsets associated with flourishing should be viewed in their socio-ecological context. If we do that, we can see how material and social adversity seem to predict lower perceived control and lower positive affect. And maybe this isn't such a bad thing. Maybe what people are doing is recalibrating their sense of actual control and their sense of how they should feel based on their read of their socioecology in a way that's very rational. And also we've seen how objective and subjective SES predict not impaired selective executive functioning, but selective executive functioning, not impaired self-regulation, but selective goal prioritization, prioritizing short-term over long-term goals, and not just kind of a nasty attitude overall, but more selective social trust. And the question there is whether this is this kind of adaptive modulation to context. And if these things are rational recalibrations and adaptive modulations, then perhaps we shouldn't be thinking about intervening to improve mindsets. We should be thinking about intervening to improve socioecologies. In separate work, I've looked at how when you take these mindsets to the extreme, you can, if you get people to internalize these mindsets in a very extreme form, the notion of the marketized self, which is a construct that I'm developing and measuring, you can find that it's linked with enhancing marginalization of those low in SES and also harms well-being and social solidarity more generally. But I just thought I'd think for the last couple of minutes on potential interventions, one way in which we don't test interventions, and but I do think that I can't resist making the point that a socio-ecological psychological analysis can be brought to bear on interventions that are not necessarily individual and behavioral. That is to say that psychologists can play an important role in articulating how socioecologies shape decision-making such that we can generate insights for improving socioecologies, not just for improving behaviors. So here's just one example of how Ivan has looked at this. He's looked across countries with the World Values Survey to see, do we always see this relationship between income and perceived control? Or to what extent might that be buffered? And if you look at the blue lines here, we see a buffering effect, not such low levels of control among those low in income, if we have strong social support government programs. So in terms of how much money goes to those low in SES in society and the extent to which you're have a healthcare system that is universal and government funded. There might be a buffering effect here as well, when it comes to the link between income and trust narrowing, but this is much smaller. The interaction is significant, but it's a much smaller effect. Another way of thinking about especially the affective dimension of poverty is in terms of intervening in how people appraise why it is that they're poor. So if you ask people questions such as, well, how fair do you think society is? Versus, do you think society is fair, or do you think it needs to be radically restructured? It turns out that your understanding of how society came to be the way it is interacts with your socioeconomic status to predict how much shame you feel. And among those who are low in system acceptance or who challenge the fairness of society, we don't see these lower levels of social shame. And we don't see the strong relationship between socioeconomic status and shame. So that's another perhaps way out, is in shaping the social representations around poverty. Now I just wanted to flag up this set of systematic reviews we did for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation back in 2017. We're updating some of these now, but at the end of that report, we lay out a number of potential intervention points. Yes, some at the individual level, but also beyond that to the level of the community, the level of the neighborhood, the level of institutions and wider society. And I'd be happy to explore some of those a bit more. But for now, I'll say thank you and open to questions.
Thank you. That was wonderful, Jennifer. So there's a microphone. Maybe if there are questions, we'll have to do it that way. Questions? So, yeah. Go.
Yeah, that was really, really interesting. I'm wondering, how have you been able to get policymakers to buy into this? So this is something that Luis and I talk about often, and it's maybe more prominent in the US, where it's such an individualistic kind of frame that everybody's just making these personal choices. What do you think is necessary to convince people that actually it's not only won't it work to focus on the individual, it's wrong-headed, that people are adapting rationally, optimally, maybe even to their circumstances. And if you tell them, oh, you need to slow down or you need to make better decisions, you're actually blunting, what, for example, there are programs here in Chicago that often, with mixed success, that are trying to get adolescents to slow down and to be, longer decision makers. But if these kids have shorter time horizons and things like that, their behaviors might be quite rational. So I'm trying to think about what are the ways in which evidence or what other data do we need to try to convince people that you can't put this onus on the individual. You have to intervene upon the environment.
Yeah, it's a great question because it's just so hard. And the biggest issue I think I've come up against is to get away from the individual framing. Because as soon as I come along and say how poverty affects decision-making processes, it all becomes about the decision-making processes. Or, as soon as you call in a psychologist, then it's all about, oh, so how can we improve the decision-making processes? And that's really hard. And I, almost to the extent that I think that's not the right pitch. Another way of doing the pitch is, I do think obviously the experimental approach and having people go through these experiences themselves and seeing how it can change their behavior. There is a game called Play Spent, SPENT, that kind of gives you this experience of not being able to, working in a precarious job and not being able to get through. It just gives a temporary perspective taking. That can be powerful. But the other way is to think about, well, what are existing potential systemic interventions? And to what extent can we think about the benefits of those interventions in terms of not only benefits in well-being or benefits in economics or for equality, but with an additional bonus that you could improve people's decision-making. So I'm going to think about universal basic income, for example, because it's a nice example because it actually addresses some of the things that we talked about. It's, provides what is basic. So it addresses, scarcity, material scarcity. It's an income. So it addresses predictability because it's predictable every month, and it's universal. So by accessing it, I am not, my poverty or a perceived failure is not made salient. I'm accessing it by virtue of just being a citizen or being a part of a community. And so what that's doing is that's projecting or addressing various socioecological cues that might yield benefits, not only in terms of well-being, and we've seen the benefits of well-being, but also in terms of decision-making. So you can kind of frame, just stay with the systemic intervention and then highlight the decision-making benefits, as opposed to starting with decision-making and then trying to get out to the ecology. I'm still struggling with this, but it's just a recent thought on it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your talk. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on interventions that kind of would go off of this idea in settings where perhaps you can't change the overall ecology in terms of socioeconomic status. So I'm thinking of like nonprofit settings, or perhaps like in a school with high rates of poverty and the like, where the folks in charge of that organization may not be able to provide people with more income. But thinking of that example you said of like perceived predictability in the marshmallow example, have you had any discussions or come into conversation with folks about interventions that could perhaps improve some of the perceived predictability or social trust or that kind of thing to help with decision making, even if you don't have the ability to make broader socio-ecological changes in that moment?
Yeah, thanks. And I sometimes the thrust of my talk seems that, to throw out the window some of these interventions. I actually think they play a really important role, especially, in really helping people to deal with adversity that's in no way a fault of their own. I mean, one idea is to think about, not just like addressing societal structures, but try to think about microecologies, and in particular the role of institutions and organizations as ecologies. So in that work on the psychology of social class that I mentioned, a lot of how this is narrated is in terms of people from working class backgrounds not having less agency, but having an interdependent sense of agency. And the issue in terms of when people from working class backgrounds go to university and don't perform as well is because university contexts are built on middle class values that are very much about independence. And in this work, which has mostly been led by Nicole Stevens and Sarah Townsend and her collaborators, who's not far away, by the way, in Northwestern, in this work, they found that if you intervene at the institutional level and portray university as a place also for interdependent norms and for achieving interdependent goals, and then those performance differences between people from middle and working class contexts go away. And so that's kind of reflecting the fact that, you know, it's not that there's one better way of being, it's that the world is built to reward one way of being, and that to the extent that we can shift those contexts to make other ways of being just as valued, I think that's helpful. And yet the world still is built for a particular to evoke a particular way of behaving, and it is built by middle class people and run by middle class people. So you still also need to help people navigate those kinds of environments. And it's just that tension between teaching people skills that don't detract from their ability to navigate the harsh ecologies that maybe they have to go home to after school, but also enable them to unlock and figure out how to navigate other environments that might not be so harsh, that are more predictable, such that they could get payoffs if they held off for later things. So it's not a set answer. I agree with you that there is a space for that work, but maybe we can think about meso level settings too.
Thanks so much for the talk. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to kind of questions of generalizability, especially with the kind of executive functioning pieces of your work and other people's work that you talked about. I'm thinking of this kind of classic critique that we've had over the last couple of years in psychology that, okay, well, now if we're context and task dependent, do we need to now look at every single context associated with poverty and every single kind of task that we expect to be relevant? Yeah, so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that might play into kind of the bigger picture that you've been building.
Oh, right. Sorry, I thought where you were going to go actually was to do a cross-cultural generalizability, but it sounds like you're thinking about this kind of infinite regress of looking at every contextual detail. Could you outline that?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think everything is down to context, and I don't think every aspect of context matters. And I think that we could bottom out that infinite regress by just considering what's most important to survival, or what has been important to survival in our ancestral past. And there, you know, some key things really matter. Do you have what you need to survive, and do you have what you need to participate in a social grouping such that you can rely on others in that social grouping? And so I think what social adversity is it's the lack of having reliable cooperation partners, and that's key. And what material, I mean, it's quite obvious what material adversity is. And so I do think that, like, there are some socio-ecological cues that are more important than others, and that these are the ones we should focus on, especially if we're thinking about these kinds of issues. Of course, there are other cues, and the nice thing about a socio-ecological approach is that it sensitizes us to thinking about social norms and cultural contexts. But I very much approach, like, understandings of the role of context in kind of what I hope to be a conceptually principled way, a first principles manner, in terms of thinking about, I do think that we can ultimately articulate the key aspect of socioecologies, be very precise about what we think is going on in those. And that's what maybe work you'll hear later in this term we'll go on to talking about specific kinds of unpredictability, for example, and then be able to articulate the ways in which that should affect decision making in precise ways as part of a universal theory, and not a different theory for different settings. That said, I am, with Manisha Dhingra, thinking about cross-cultural generalizability of some of these findings, especially to the extent that we need to think about notions of control and agency differently in interdependent cultural settings versus independent ones, where we have maybe a conjoint sense of agency, or our self-regulation is not playing out in the temporal domain, it's playing out in terms of the relationships in which you're embedded. So I do think that also complicates the questions that we ask once we leave the Western context. Yeah, so I've answered both questions, sorry.
Thank you.
Okay, perhaps one more question, then we have to let Jennifer go. This is late for her. I had a general question, maybe if I can have that. It's maybe a little philosophical, but it goes back to the issues of interventions. We just had a very terrible few years, right, with COVID, in terms of predictability, for example, and in terms of even social cohesion for reasons that we've been more isolated and so on. In Chicago and American cities, we definitely see a rise in reckless behavior of different kinds, antisocial behavior in some kinds. Of course, now at the same time, we're facing problems of big problems in society, like equity or climate change, that do require large-scale cooperation and do require, steady action over the long term. So several people have started talking about entering a vicious cycle in which we don't collectively have the mindset or the structures to actually come to those decisions. But I think your talk asks, perhaps provides some cues as to how can we counter this uncertainty, which will be a characteristic of the world going forward anyway, in terms of creating meaningful change over the long term.
That is a tricky question. I mean, I will say that sometimes there's opportunities in these moments of universal uncertainty to enhance perspective taking from those low in SES. That's just one thing that we unexpectedly found when we did an experimental prime. We asked people to think about the ways in which the pandemic had made their lives more unstable. We found that middle class people's level of sense of control goes all the way down to those of working class or low SES people. And we're trying to develop an intervention there to then say, well, by the way, this is what a whole segment of the population experiences all the time, never being able to predict, not having control over whether you go on holiday and where. But more generally, to the extent that society is exposed to cues of unpredictability, and then that maybe triggers a collective mindset of present orientation. Yeah, I mean, I'd be concerned about that. And I suppose just learning about the ways in which our behavior might be a product of a particular set of cues can help. Well, it can help open up perhaps a sense of role of intervention, but of behavioral intervention to help people to realize how important things are, but also to be very careful with those, because perhaps, in talking about climate crisis or in highlighting every kind of major weather event, we're making people feel the world is more unpredictable, such that we collectively say, oh, well, let's just seize the day. Let's not go to the future. But hopefully learning more about it helps us think about how, even communication campaigns and even political rhetoric, they are part of the socioecology. And maybe that's that kind of discursive space is a place that we can intervene to encourage people to think about the long term, and also to encourage them to think about the ways in addressing the long term, not just as about what you as an individual could do, because that's related to this other work that I talked about, this kind of marketized self. And perhaps we can think about what we as a collective can do, because there are other things being primed by context. And whether it's just thinking about me alone versus us, I think is going to be another important dimension of how we address some of the problems you mentioned there.
Jennifer, thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you. Take care.
And you have a standing invitation, and we owe you dinner, at least one. So I hope sometime we can do that. Thank you so much.